My guest today is Professor Philip Lebel, who's Emeritus Professor of Economics at Montclair State University. His research spans drivers of economic growth and management of risk. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
I didn't ask you, do you go by Phil or Philip?
Philip.
Philip?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to start with one of your older papers, 2007, The Role of Creative Innovation in Economic Growth, Some International Comparisons. You say export-driven policies in East Asia have thus far produced dramatic increases in real per capita income. At the same time, sustainable growth requires that technological innovation proceed at comparable rates if mutual gains from globalization are to be realized. So you have a pattern regression model in the paper. By East Asia, which countries do you focus on?
I haven't pulled up all that sample with me, but the paper actually lists them. So I think it's China, it's South Korea, it's Japan, Thailand, India. I think also Philippines, Indonesia. So some of the major economies, let's say, of East and South Asia, were drawn as a sample.
Right.
And I would just offer a qualifier in saying whenever you aggregate across a geographic region, of course, you obscure some of the differences that exist among countries, not only at a policy level, but also at the empirical level. So I just was trying to capture, to the extent that I could, any meaningful sets of trends and patterns that would emerge from that.
Yeah. And the goal here is to look at how innovation is really driving, or how innovation is sort of interacting with export policies, right? So what do you find from the regression?
Well, the point that I was making is that when you have risk, and we probably should talk about that somewhere in this conversation, I'm using a measure of aggregate country risk, which is both political, it's economic, it's environmental, and financial. And when you have larger aggregate risk that's in play, it tends to inhibit a lot of innovation. Some people like to think of this in Schumpeterian terms and saying, well, Schumpeter always was a disruptor. That's the kind of the buzzword that we see today, being a disruptive technology, for example. But I think the evidence says that when you have aggregate risk at a very large level, it inhibits innovation, it inhibits investment. There's no such thing as a riskless environment, that's for sure. But the point is that when aggregate risk is at such a high level, it really tends to inhibit the level of innovation that could be taking place. Now, risk alone doesn't do it. If you want me to continue with this, I could say that it depends on institutions, for example. And the whole point of that paper and the paper that I wrote on Africa is to talk about the role of basically property rights and an independent judiciary as managing risk. And when a country, for example, has its governance institutions heavily overweighted, if you will, or intervened by a political institution for purely political purposes, it tends to also cause greater risk for people to make a decision because it becomes uncertain. You just don't know whether it's an authoritarian or democratic regime that it's going to promote the level of innovation. It can be too cherry. I mean, we could cite some current examples, but I'll just put that aside and say that's the finding that I was coming up with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this was in 2007. This was before all hell broke loose in the financial markets.
Yeah.
So when you think about aggregate risk, though, clearly, if you don't have stable governments, if you don't have stable expectations of future regimes,
right.
I guess, then you cannot really invest into innovation. So uncertainty always dampens innovation, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so, so you looked at this country sort of in a package. But did you find differences among them, or is it not something that you looked at?
I did not try because I was using panel regression for, in this case, emphasizing East Asia countries. But I should say that some of the research that I have done is aggregating groups broader than East Asia. I mean, I have a sample that I wrote the paper on Africa on, for example. Then I have one in Central and Latin America. Then I have European countries. And with each of them, I'm trying to come up with some notion of how risk inhibits or promotes growth and how that mechanism takes place. Does it take place, as I certainly suggest in the East Asia paper, through trade, export-led growth, or are there other mechanisms where it begins to unfold?
And so you have some policy implications here. So I'm going back to the East Asia paper. So what are you concluding from the paper from a policy perspective?
What kind of what?
From a policy perspective. So how should countries manage this aggregate risk? How should they be managing it if they want innovation to?
Yeah, I point to one obvious thing, which is establish a clear regime on property rights, and make sure that your judiciary is independent. When I say independent, I mean if you have a commercial code, for example, and you're saying, okay, someone comes up with an invention, they want to get a copyright or a trademark or something on, make sure that your judiciary is able to defend that, and not only within your country, but also that gives it credibility in defending it abroad. There was a time when, just to take a little perspective on time here, Japan was being accused of, back in the 60s and 70s, just imitating things from the West, and not paying any attention to copyright laws. And then people are making the same accusation now about China. Well, what was interesting about Japan is that as soon as Japan realized that their innovations could be absconded off with by somebody else, all of a sudden they became great defenders of property rights. And so what I'm talking about is the reciprocity of property rights as being mutually beneficial to all the parties that are concerned for that. And it's a hard lesson. So, I mean, right now people are saying, well, look at what China's doing, they want to beat up on China. But my answer is that China's going through a transition itself, and that it will come to appreciate that when it sees its own innovations are being basically absconded off by somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious, right? Without intellectual property rights, you cannot really get robust innovation. I know a little bit about this, Philip. I grew up in India, and there is sort of another implication here. I don't know if it's in the paper or not. Maybe I want to get your perspective on this. So India, for example, does a lot of the pharmaceuticals manufacturing.
Yes.
And it has been sort of very lax intellectual property rights and compliance. And it seems to me, looking back, such a regime actually doesn't allow the country to move up the value curve. So, they have been very good at, sort of raw material production, intermediates, and those types of things, but haven't really moved up the curve in terms of real innovation. Do you see that an issue?
Well, I mean, we could invoke Walt Rostow's stages of economic growth in this, I suppose, and say that, yes, at one point, an early stage when a country is opening up its economy, let's say, both internally and potentially externally, a lot of the innovation is imitative and it becomes derivative, because what you're really doing is you're taking applied technologies that have been demonstrated in the marketplace and you're looking at how they become commercialized in a broader environment. Beyond some point, then, we start talking about more fundamental kinds of research and how does that take place, and what are the constraints and incentives that a country puts in place in order to reward that. Just taking Indian pharmaceuticals, it was known that there was a conflict between mostly Western pharmaceutical companies who were saying, well, India is just producing low-cost generic drugs, you're not responding to them in a way, and it had to do with what is the optimal time frame for a patent. Now, I didn't try to tackle that. I don't think the data was rich enough to be able to tackle it, but some have said that in a rapidly changing environment, which technology is evolving so quickly, is it reasonable to say that a patent should be valid for 30 plus years or something of that sort when in fact these things are being changed? I don't have an easy answer for that. All I can say is that if a patent has been granted, the question is, well, do other countries recognize that time horizon as a valid one? And in the case of Indian companies, they were able to come up with generic equivalents of a lot of these pharmaceutical products and producing them at low cost. And what gave them kind of moral leverage was that they're saying, well, we're going to produce these and make them available in developing countries, and whereas you countries in the West have these prohibitive prices you're charging on them, and that's mostly for your own markets, not for the vast majority of the population, which in fact may not be the richest in the world, far from it, and they were still eager to have it. And so it created kind of a market tension, if you will, between the idea of going low cost to imitation on a generic pathway compared to those that had the original patents that were there. If you tighten up that patent control to an extreme extent, after a while, nobody's able to come in and make any innovations, or they become artificial derivations that they have for it, looking for the slightest thing. It's a little bit like saying Microsoft or Apple, how different is one version, let's say, of their operating system different from the preceding one? Or how different is an iPhone X generation, let's say iOS 13, or we have now, or the Model 13 come to 12? What they're trying to do is to capture some measure of patent protection to recoup the investment that they have made. And that's the same claim that pharmaceutical companies say. They argue that the high cost of a new drug coming onto the market is essential to underwrite the cost of the next generation for that. As I say, it's a conflict, and of course it becomes very problematic when you're in an age of COVID, for example, as we are now, and you're saying, well, what should you do? Well, I think the United States brokered some flexibility on that when they were able to expedite the bringing of the Pfizer and the Moderna variations, the mRNA technology, to the marketplace very quickly, and they were a little bit lax about the other kinds of things. So when I say that you need property rights, you can't just say, well, property rights don't matter. That's not true, because if property rights don't matter, I can guarantee the data will demonstrate that nobody will innovate. Because why should I do something if I can't capture, the results of the efforts that I've undertaken in that? So for a country like India or even China, at some point they have to say, we do have to offer a measure of protection for genuine innovation that takes place in our economy. And if we don't do so, we'll never move up the ladder, as you said a while ago, that technology ladder.
Yeah, you can sort of get stuck. I want to just touch on the COVID vaccine question, which is very topical. Exposed changing rules of the game never really work. And so you have to ask, if you were to say these companies who have created vaccines have to now give it up, what will be their incentives in the next round? So the US stance on that was very different from the EU stance. The EU was more pure in the sense that patent rights should remain as continuing incentives for these companies to innovate. Mm-hmm. So changing rules afterward is not really a good practice, is it?
No, and it does raise the stakes, and it adds to more risk. It makes the next generation of innovators demand a higher premium for their product because they fear it will be undermined in due course, by some intermediate stage of the patent life. But let me put it this way. In the case of COVID, it's not just a matter of the immediate profit that goes to a firm. It's that there are repercussions, secondary effects that occur from that transaction. So if we don't tackle, for example, the COVID pandemic on a global basis, who's to be immune from that after a while? I mean, you get a certain level of immunity, then you have some new variant. Now it's Omicron, it used to be Delta. So in this sense, you can think of a pandemic or anything that fights a pandemic almost as a global public good, something that countries should be committing public resources to and not necessarily requiring that it reach the bottom line to satisfy investors. Now, you have to satisfy investors to some extent. And if you totally undermine it, yes, they won't innovate at all. But that's kind of an in-between, I think, measure for all of this.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative, the right policy would be for countries to buy vaccines and supply freely to their populations. And as you say, it's a global problem. So I think, I mean, we are a little bit off track here, but, I felt that it's very difficult to tackle this country by country. You have to get many, many billions of people vaccinated before you actually, take care of the problem. Mm-hmm. But we specialized country by country, and it didn't seem to have worked really well.
Yeah. Well, as I say, that paper back in 2007 was not based on COVID. It didn't even exist at that point. And I was just simply looking at the fundamental problem of innovation. How do you nurture it? I guess the one point that I would emphasize in all of this, because I think it really rings true, is that when it is government that does the innovation, oftentimes they fall short for it because they're not necessarily better equipped to see what the future is like. And if I may, let me just give you one example of it, because I think I've alluded to this a bit in my book. When the internet was still in its almost stillborn, yet born, it wasn't even anywhere near anybody's conscious awareness. I had been with a friend in France. He was a professor on the faculty at the University of Paris, and his son was a student at a very prestigious lycée. And I was just coming back from a trip in Africa at the time, and his son said, "Oh, let me think. I'm going to go check my grades." And so I said, well, what are you going to do with that? He said, oh, well, I have a Minitel. Well, see, Minitel was France's first answer. It was developed by France Telecom of a small box. It looked almost like an early version of a Microsoft, a Macintosh computer. He was typing in a few numbers. He's basically dialing in like a DSL arrangement, and he dials in, and he gets his grades. And I said, gosh, there was nothing like that in the U.S. at that time. And I thought, the French are really on the cutting edge. It was fantastic. Well, what the French didn't do is, this was by France Telecom, which was a government enterprise at that time, and they didn't see any need to do anything more about it. Well, all of a sudden you have these cowboys like, Bill Gates and coming up with, Microsoft and Explorer and these different innovations for servers and so forth. That came to dominate the world because this furious pace of innovation on what would be the best way to have basically a search engine that would enable you to gain access to it. And nobody had a formula in advance. Nobody could see how consumers were necessarily going to respond. Well, the French a few years ago, they abandoned Minitel, even though at one point they were on the cutting edge. So it's an example of when government may do something with the best of intentions. And at the time, Minitel was outstanding, but it was not based on what I call the entrepreneurial instinct. It was not something that, it was an engineering product, and they didn't see the need to market this or to innovate it in a way that would be better for other generations. And that's one of the, you can call it either good or insidious things about capitalism. It's always in the process of refining, upending, innovating technologies to adapt to new needs as they perceive them, sometimes creating needs, but other times responding to them.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about your other paper, Managing Risk in Africa Through Institutional Reform.
Yes.
And again, the issue here is African economies, the per capita growth has been low, and many countries have governance issues, right? So I don't know if anything have changed, Philip. I haven't really followed. So this from 2008. Do you think last 12 years things have improved in Africa?
There have been what I call sporadic signs that give a measure for hope. And essentially, and this is based on, I've worked in some 30 countries in Africa over the years. I've traveled around. I've done it in a variety of capacities. We have to look at the historical context. And someone in India could appreciate this as well, which is, if you have a colonial inheritance, if you were one time the colonial property of a mother country, you naturally resent that. You naturally want to have your own independence and so forth. So with the wave of independence that came out of the late 50s, starting with, say, Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah, and then you go to these other leaders, you have countries that are saying, oh, let's be nation builders. Let's do this quickly. And in the case of, I don't want to pick on Kwame Nkrumah as only one, but let's rapidly industrialize. Let's do all this thing right away. Most of these things were statist decisions. When I say statist, I mean they were relying on government. And their argument was, well, under colonialism, we didn't have any private institutions. We didn't have equity markets, for example. We didn't have an infrastructure other than what was geared towards, say, exports back to the mother country in some way. And so now what we want to do is develop our own technologies in a way. And it's the same weakness that I talked about in the case of looking at Minitel. When it was just government driven, they could not foresee exactly how the market was going to work. There were not enough feedback mechanisms to say we need to adapt and change and so forth. Well, then of course you have a lot of civil unrest. The concept of political legitimacy came into fore in many of these countries because they're saying, well, you're either puppets of some colonial, neo-colonial arrangement, or you're operating in a way that really doesn't provide true development. Or they talk about corruption. In other words, the leadership have cronies, and it's crony capitalism that's prevailing. That was a common phrase you probably have heard of, many times coming across. The positive signs are, though, that occasionally when you allow some innovation to take place and you have the government sort of limit but define clearly what its role is going to be, you get spurs of growth that are taking place. And ironically, and now tragically, one country where that was taking place was in Ethiopia, which is a country I've lived in and I know to some extent. And before this current civil war undermined much of the country's prospects, they were developing from a very low level, fairly high rate of growth of per capita income. And why was that? It was because the state had chosen to step back from a series of military regimes. Haile Selassie, the emperor, was overthrown in 1974. Then you had Mengistu impose a rigid kind of Marxist top-down authoritarian regime and wage an unsuccessful war in Eritrea, which he eventually lost, and then he was overthrown. Mullah Zenawi began these steps toward kind of stepping back and allowing the marketplace to play a greater role. And that began to spur some initiative. Now, it invited a lot of investment from China. China has been known for building these, what they're called Belt and Road initiatives. In other words, it's an infrastructure investment. The downside of that is that you wind up getting indebted and you have trouble with being able to pay it all off. So initially it looks favorable, but I don't want to take away the fact that when infrastructure is developed, it facilitates a lot of other things taking place. And so Ethiopia was developing at a fairly rapid pace there for a while. The other example I would cite was Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. The Ivory Coast is a country that is primarily known as a coffee exporter. They produce essentially the Robusta kind of coffee, which is used in instant coffee. And their main competition for a number of years would be the Latin American producers like Colombia or Brazil, which had Arabica coffee. Ironically, Ethiopia also is a coffee exporter. It produces Arabica coffee. And what Houphouët-Boigny, who was the president of Cote d'Ivoire for a number of years, did is he basically was started off with a very humble level, said, look, we've got a product that compete, and all we want to do is just have access to the marketplace. And for a while, Ivory Coast was one of the most rapidly growing countries in West Africa, had one of the highest levels of per capita income, and they were getting into a lot of innovative technologies, educational television, educational radio, a lot of things like that. That again got undermined. Why? Because of civil unrest in the country. After Houphouët-Boigny, you had governance issues that have been still with the Ivorians even today.
Yeah, I was wondering, Philip, I don't know, I mean, I haven't really thought about this. Do you think Africa is a bit fragmented? In other words, would they benefit from some of these countries getting together into trading blocs like the European Union or something like that? Do you think that kind of a scale will allow them to get more stable?
Well, I would say yes and no. First of all, the Francophone countries of West Africa use a common currency. So it's like the euro, but it was there even before the euro was created. But most of the trade that these countries had was export driven. In other words, on a same lateral basis or longitudinal basis, these countries basically had comparable products that are competing perhaps even with each other. So the idea of having lower tariff barriers, which they have done, the African Union started off essentially as an economic agency and then took on this political responsibility about governing conflict and trying to control conflict in various countries. Yes, it is a step forward, but there is not such a range of differences in the profile of your economic advantage, so to speak, that you have. That necessarily means it will produce miraculous growth. But to the extent that these countries can develop more cooperative relationships, the answer is yes. By all means, they should be doing it. I thought that when you have, say, the African Union stepping in and trying to mediate a resolution to the conflict in the Sudan, for example, just one of these, or in other areas where you have Africa peacekeeping troops, I think that's a positive move in the right direction.
Yeah, so you have a book that came out recently, Risk and the State, How Economics and Neuroscience Shape Political Legitimacy to Address Geopolitical, Environmental, and Health Risks for Sustainable Governance. So what's the main message in the book?
Well, the main message, I probably should have had a shorter title. But the main message is essentially part of what we've been talking about in our conversation so far, which is to say how governments organize and respond to the presence of various types of risks has a great bearing on basically on the legitimacy of a government, as we can all say. But that oversimplification I tried to break down, I wanted to unpack that, so to speak, and say, well, what do economics tell us about how governance affects political legitimacy, and how does neuroscience do it? Well, neuroscience has been around, at least in the social sciences, for some time. It's behavioral economics, it's behavioral finance, and essentially what it's doing is providing a counterpoint to the paradigm of the utterly rational individual, homo economicus, that all your decisions are rational. And, when I would be teaching courses over the years, I love to cite the little trope about two economists walking down the street, and one sees a $20 bill and says to the other, look, there's a $20 bill, pick it up. The other one says, no, that's not a $20 bill. If it was, somebody would have picked it up already. So it's just, in other words, the assumption of extreme rationality, which confounded a lot of issues and questions in economics. So what behavioral economics has done is taking into account for that. And so my point was that if you look at what economics has to say on this subject, you can start off and say, well, let's take the simple Adam Smith paradigm, wealth of nations that, let's fight against mercantilism, which is state-guided intervention in the economy. Allow markets to make a decision. Well, that still has a lot of truth and a lot of resonance. But as time has gone on, as research has evolved, what we're discovering is that in order for that to work well, what you have to have are the conditions of a competitive economy. And the conditions are you can't have monopolistic arrangements, for example, and you can't have informational asymmetries. In other words, years ago, Gary Akerlof got a Nobel Prize for writing a rather prosaic sounding article called The Market for Lemons, which was buying used vehicles in the market. And there's a tendency to undervalue used products in a way. So how do we get more informational symmetry? Well, that's a role for our property institutions and how we develop it. In other words, and can it be done in market terms? Well, how does a used car seller make a convincing argument? Well, the answer is, I'll offer you a guarantee for this. Even though this is a used vehicle product, I'm going to certify its serviceability and operational characteristics for a designated period of time. So warranties help to do that. But in many cases, you have tried and untrue products against which you have a lot of risk and uncertainty. You just don't know how they're going to work. So what economics has to bring to this conversation is that there are certain functions that the state can perform and should be performing to help markets work. And so, one of the things that I took up in this book was the age-old history about looking at competition, for example, and how is competition affecting or interacting with risk. And the thing I cite is, the corporation. The concept of the corporation, which I think we generally credit the Dutch in the 17th century when they had their first successful stock exchange in basically 1601, attracts investors because you have a separation of ownership from the responsibility for something, liability. So you buy a share of stock. If it goes up, you win. If it goes down, you lose. There's no other mechanism for that. But by having shared risk, but between the owners and the investors, it tends to attract a lot of capital formation. Well, that was an important innovation. So the question is how we develop institutions to manage it. Today, we even have limited liability corporations, and you can have partners in a medical practice and setting an LLC. These are just what I call passive institutions that are designed to manage risk. And they're an important innovation, but we need a legal system to back them up, which we do. We create laws. So that's a function that government steps in to perform to enable risk to be managed in a reasonable way. And once you get excessive risk out of line or something, that's when it calls for greater intervention. And our perception of risk varies over time. Well, let me bring in neuroscience. Many of our perspectives about whether government is doing enough or too little has to do with how our brain is perceiving phenomena, in this case, economic phenomena. So when Ben Bernanke, who was a professor of economics at Princeton University, had studied Milton Friedman and his book on a monetary history of the United States, here he was at the seat of power in the 2008 financial crisis, 2007, 2009. And Milton Friedman had not passed away not so long before, or about that period of time. And so Bernanke had studied the Great Depression, as had Milton Friedman. And so he said, Uncle Milty, that's how he's known, we have learned the lessons of the Great Depression, and we're not going to make that mistake again. What he was talking about is that in 1929, with the stock market crash, the Federal Reserve, which had been created in 1913, but at that point had power to control interest rates, for example, and credit, decided to raise interest rates at a time when they should have done just the opposite. And the point was, and this is echoed in John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Depression interpretation, it was, quote, speculation. That was the cause of it. So if we just wring that out, we'll solve the problem. What Friedman did in this monetary history, he wrote this for the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was called A Monetary History of the United States, 1857 to 1960, and it came out in 1963. He traced the supply of money as controlled by the Federal Reserve and interest rates. And he said convincingly that the Federal Reserve should not have raised interest rates when the markets began to collapse. Well, what did Ben Bernanke do when he was, some 30 plus years later, many years later? What is he doing? He's basically saying, we're going to stimulate the economy when we see equity markets and housing markets prices going down. And that's precisely what he did. And so, the ARRA, the American Recovery Act, that was passed under the Obama administration, 2009, was deliberately an intention to use what came to be known as quantitative easing, which was a measure of having the Federal Reserve basically buy up treasury securities to create greater liquidity. Turns out that that was the thing that saved the U.S. economy in that period of time from having what could have been an even worse event than the great stock market crash and the subsequent depression. I like to point out, and I'm not making that in the book so directly, I like to say that somebody like Ben Bernanke, in my view, is an unsung hero. He's an unsung hero because he forestalled something that could have been an absolute and utter disaster. But what media tend to cover is, well, what did you do here? That sort of thing. It's not, you're not able to observe the pain that would have been inflicted had you done nothing. So he tends to be thought of as, okay, you're a steward and you did your job in some way, but I don't think he's as appreciated as I think he should be in terms of what he did, because he steered the Federal Reserve in the most judicious way to avert an even worse downturn.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. So your argument is that there are roles that the government can play,
yes,
to make systems better. And I was thinking about, you mentioned information and risk. So when I think about the modern economy, almost everything that we do is information. I could argue a pharmaceutical product, an autonomous car, a smart home. It's all information. There is no product that is information-less anymore. So the currency for the economy is information. So then the broader question is, do you see, or what role do you see for the government to play in sort of information intermediation in a system that is largely driven by information?
Well, I think what they could do is just set clear rules, once again, that will back up intellectual property rights. Beyond that, I don't think it should do more. One of the things that's really ironic today is people are beating up on Twitter and Microsoft because they're not doing enough to get rid of, misinformation and so forth. In some other country, it's the government that controls that misinformation to it. I mean, ironically, in the United States, what you have, in effect, are private firms being held accountable as though they are quasi-judicial institutions. That's how they're thought of. Because, somebody utters something, Donald Trump utters something, and it may or may not be true, and there's no cross-checking of that and so forth. I think we have to give credit to these private information portals, so to speak, to be able to find a judicious way. But to the extent that you expect them to become governors, then that's almost a form of fascism, because under fascism, you have private ownership, but you're executing the command of government. And you got to draw a line there somewhere. You have to say, wait a minute, how much should they be obligated to communicate or basically survey and censor at any one time? So we're in murky waters when it comes to how to respond to that one.
But one issue I see is the market power issue, Philip. So, our antitrust laws, I don't know how effective they have been. There are six companies that hold about 1/3 of the market capitalization of S&P 500 today.
Yep.
And you could easily make an argument, the large search company, search is really a utility and should really be regulated on a return basis, just like we do electric utilities. So there's a market power issue with these information companies that a lot of people are worried about. So what do you think about that?
I will think that I would ask anyone who is looking at that issue to pay attention to a historical experience. Here's the example. The great decision about Standard Oil Company as one example of that. When it broke it up, people may not recognize that John D. Rockefeller became richer after the breakup of the Supreme Court decision of 1911 using the Sherman Antitrust Act. When you have government going to apply vigorous antitrust, usually they don't have an idea of what's going to be the result of that. The standard paradigm, the mental paradigm that we work against is more buyers and sellers, the better. And in general, that's a reasonable principle. But the other thing that I would add into this equation is that innovation changes it. Years ago, we used to have serious, profound arguments about the automobile industry in the United States. And we had laws that were on the books that were going to break up them, and we were going to use antitrust to break up General Motors and Ford and Chrysler. Well, what are these countries today? They've become dwarfs relative to the size of the market and the number of international firms. I mean, so you look at what Japan has done. Ironically, one of the best things that would be a tempering factor would be to have more open access to information portals, so to speak. And I think that's, in a way, that becomes available. I mean, I don't know what your own personal, how you spend time to gather information. And I'm not going to say that I'm a genius by any means, but I will tell you that I will read things across the political spectrum, then arrive at my own opinions. In other words, I don't try to operate in a silo where I want some self-reinforcing mechanism that feeds my own preconceived notions. I mean, that's one of the neuroscience phenomena. We tend to gravitate toward things to reinforce our preconceived ideas. So if you're a conservative, you're tending to migrate toward Fox News because you think they have the received wisdom, and you think that CNN and MSNBC are communists. I mean, I'm exaggerating here, you know. And conversely, if you are on the left end of the spectrum, you look to CNN and MSNBC to uphold America's virtues, and Fox News, you know, they're just a bunch of, they'll call them fascists or some other kind of thing. This is an absurd dialogue that we maintain with this. The answer is look at all of them, look at other sources. So I don't think that there is something that says, you know, these companies have to be broken up. The other thing I would add to it is that competition will probably undermine them. You know, ironically, there was a time when IBM was the dominant player, and there was this little college dropout by the name of Steve Jobs, and he said, "I got a better idea." You know, so Steve Wozniak, he comes up with something called the Apple computer, and they upended the mainframe computer industry. It was then dominated by IBM. Well, Ramsey Clark was the attorney general back in the heydays of Lyndon Johnson, where he lodged that suit against IBM. Well, it became totally ridiculous after a while because we moved from mainframe computing to mini computers and then to desktop computers, and now we have everything on our iPhone. I mean, so that technology innovation process undermines the competitive advantage that a firm tends to have over time. That's hard to see that right now when you say, but look at what, you know, Microsoft and these other companies have. They've got a lock on it. Well, they face competition, and it could be something that will draw other entrants and developing, you know, some different innovative product, and we see that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have strong opinions on this, Philip, but I just want to put this out there to get your perspective. So when a company has a very large amount of excess cash on their balance sheet, let's say 500 million or 500 billion in some cases,
right.
They can hire tens and thousands of lawyers and manufacture patents. And you know, a two-people company out of a university can hire 10,000 lawyers. So are we coming to a regime where excess cash in large companies will reduce innovation and competition?
What I think is, I'm looking at what I call a dynamic theory of competition. So you have to look at a firm's, not just their cash flow, but also their rate of return, net of taxes, interest, and subsidies, and all the other things. And if an industry or a firm in an industry demonstrates persistently that they're earning a premium rate of return for which there's no corresponding innovation by which they might be rewarded, you will invite innovators to come in who have nothing to do with this, and then they will compete with you, and they'll and they may be on the same scale. They may not be in the same industry, but they can bring the wherewithal of the skills and talents and human capital to take you on in a way. What example do I cite? I cite Elon Musk and Tesla. I mean, even the level of competition that we have today, here was a visionary, not modest by anybody's measure, but he said, I'm going to reinvent how we think about automobiles, you know, and it's remarkable that he's come out of nowhere. I just saw a number of, what was it, yesterday, that they're talking about making 600,000 Teslas a year in China alone. Where were the other firms and all this stuff? And so these firms may have excess cash at any one time, and they may not be on the verge of bankruptcy, but are they taking prudential risk as they should be taking is the question, and they may not be. So having excess cash is not just a matter of lawyers, because ultimately the lawyers are valued on a present value basis by what happens to the revenue stream and the profitability of the firm.
Yeah, I mean, there are two defensive mechanisms there. One is what this large company's been doing when they find an innovator, they just go buy them.
Yes.
And incorporate that into the company.
Right.
And in the case of Tesla, one can't forget that a large part of automobile, electric automobile is subsidy. It's it's 10 to 15% of taxpayer money
Right, right.
going into that product.
Yeah.
And so, Elon Musk might be really brilliant, but a lot of that is taxpayer money that we can't forget that.
No, that's an example of how government steers how we manage risk. I mean, to draw, in other words, I'm not saying all that's justified, is what I'm trying to get at. When you look at how do we have the next generation of space exploration? Well, when NASA was the only player, there might have been Soviets, with the cosmonauts, for example, and the space race at the time. John F. Kennedy said in 1961, we'll put somebody on the moon by the end of the decade. Well, we did. But after that, how does it become sustainable? Well, the answer was leave innovation to the private sector. So that's when you eventually see coming out of this, SpaceX and these other innovators saying, well, we have a new delivery vehicle or so forth. So we had the space shuttle. That was an intermediate step where we allowed private participation because people were saying, I'll pay for this payload because I'm in this field and I need the scientific results, in a zero gravity environment or something of that sort. So the space station makes sense, but increasingly it makes sense to be sustainable by private investment to be able to do it. So it's a question of how much fundamental research should government be directing. Now, in the case of batteries in Tesla, these are relatively known technologies. If you move up the cost curve, the efficiency of batteries, you move beyond the lead acid to the lithium hydride batteries, you move up, you get greater efficiency, but they're more expensive. So the question is, how do you control the cost? Well, I think it's great that you got somebody like Elon Musk who's committing, even with the subsidies he's got, to developing more efficient batteries. That's our electric future, so to speak. It's how we're going to move. If all the stuff that we talk about in terms of windmills, using solar power, those ones, you need converter technology, you need storage, battery storage to make all those things work.
Yeah, I also felt, Philip, there was a recent case that it's clearly a good thing for the Space Administration to have private companies involved. But there was a recent case where they had, just handed out $4 billion to one company without any competitive bidding and anything like that. So government allocators of resources at the government level really should be thinking about competition very systematically, right? One company could be great. Its founder could have been brilliant, but competition is quite important.
Absolutely, I agree. It's one thing where I'm leading to when I talk about how markets function is that you need markets that are as transparent as possible. Now, if you're a firm, your nighttime fantasy dream is I want to be the controller of this. I want to be the empire of the universe. But against that is society's well-being, the social wheel that we expect out of a market innovation of some kind. And so what we have to do is find kind of a balance between that and allow various participants to come in. I mean, look at the competition we had in the case of Beta versus VHS technology when we started having recording video technology coming in. Customers made a decision. They decided the future. They said, well, yes, Betamax is definitely superior in quality, but they don't have the time length on them. So people just opted for a trade-off between lower quality but greater storage density of whatever the video would be at any one time. And so then we move around. So should government make those decisions or should we allow the market to do it? And I think we had the wisdom of allowing the market to work it through rather than having government do it.
Yeah, so I want to touch on a few more things in the book. So you have a chapter here, State Formation in Space and Time.
Mm-hmm.
Quantitative measures of states. What do you mean by that?
I'm looking at is the size of an economy that exists, the range of the industries that they have, the dynamics of it, how it grows over time, and then looking also at the institutions that affect that structure. So that's a rather truncated way of addressing the fact that you had different governance models over time when economies were evolving. So, the Industrial Revolution coincided with a diminution of power of centralized governments. It was a time when the idea of absolute monarchy was no longer in favor. So if you say, well, Great Britain started, it was a pioneer with the Industrial Revolution, that's true. But by that time, what you had was a parliamentary system in which the power of the monarch was significantly reduced. I mean, Queen Victoria, yeah, she ruled for a long period of time, but how much power did she have? She did not have a lot of power. A lot of people tend to think, oh, well, it's Queen Victoria. Look, that's when the British Empire was created in the world. there were a lot of other players that had a lot to do with that. So it's a matter of how they, whether it's Palmerston or Gladstone or somebody else who was in power at the time, made decisions that the monarch just simply subsumed over. So it gets us to the question of whether, let's say, democratic institutions are important to political legitimacy. And the point that I'm making here is that there are different kinds of notions of political legitimacy at work today. And what I'm trying to do is have a broader basis of that in the West. By the West, I'm talking about West European and, say, North American institutions. We tend to take democracy for granted. Sometimes it's viewed in an arrogant way, even when we say, well, who are you to tell us, about how good democracy is and so forth. When I give a counterexample, I look at a country like China, which after Mao Zedong passed away, Deng Xiaoping comes to power. He starts devolving power, opening up markets. China's growth begins to take off. Then you have Tiananmen Square in 1989. And so what you have is an example of military imposing censorship and political repression, arresting people and so forth and detaining them. And they basically have a Faustian bargain. It's a social contract of sorts that they define for themselves what political legitimacy is. And it's this: we will produce wealth, we will produce higher levels of income, and we will reduce poverty in China. But we will not do so with an open democratic tradition that you in the West have taken for granted. So we resent anything that you think you are going to tell us about how we should govern ourselves. It's our country to govern. Well, that's one concept of political legitimacy. As long as the Chinese government delivers, people are less inclined to embrace, oh, let's great, let's have freedom of speech, let's have, the Declaration of Rights or something like that. So what we see is this paradox that China's growth has been extraordinary, and then you have basically clamping down on Hong Kong activists they came out of the British parliamentary tradition, who wanted to have more democracy. You have them coming down on basically the Uyghurs, who are Muslim. It's a small minority, but they view Tibet as their province. It's one of their areas of control, which has tensions, as you well can understand, with India, because both areas have competing interests in that zone. So China's vision of it is not embraced in some universal declaration of human rights. They find it strange to have somebody reading that. So, well, that's not how we govern ourselves.
Yeah, the irony for me is that democracies are quite fragile, right? I mean, we were pretty close to losing democracy just a few months ago.
Yeah.
And so in an ironic way, the non-democratic systems appear more stable, for better or worse, whereas democratic systems have higher risk of essentially just collapsing in some ways.
Which brings us back to this notion of how risk affects our notions of political legitimacy. And the point that I'm making is that if you have a long history in which you've had democratic upheaval in your society, of course you can be anxious if Donald Trump, is the chief architect with a January 6th insurrection, and you want to blame everything on him and all that kind of stuff. Or you can step back and say, well, there are other ways in which we can define this. And so we look to our legal systems, we look to our traditions that provide protections for human rights, and we view the Congress, the congressional building in Washington, as almost sacrosanct, as one of our valued institutions that we must protect in some way. Now, I agree with you that democracy is fragile, and there's nothing that guarantees that it will survive or that it will go on. I mean, you can go back to the Roman Republic and say, well, it was a republic, and then what happened? Julius Caesar comes along, and you have basically Brutus being killed and dictatorships ensuing. So democracy is a process, and you have to work at it. And you have to have a tolerance for differences in opinion, and not all societies have that. I would link that back to my neuroscience perspective to perceptions of risk. The Chinese culture is traditionally risk averse. It's known for that. And so they face a contradiction of how to produce wealth in China, which they've tried to do by imitating to a great extent and exporting. At the same time, providing flexibility where China can evolve its own institutions and to become more open and accountable. So that's the challenge that I think we have. But I wouldn't say that democracy is finished by any means. I think we always have, if you will, a rebound that can occur for that. And right now, the U.S. is in a process of self-examination. Even somehow, if Donald Trump is held more directly accountable for the events of January 6th, that doesn't remove the conditions that may have made possible why that occurred. And so,
I have fantasies of direct democracy, Philip. I feel like the representative form of democracy has run its course. Now we have technology. We could move into direct democracy. The biggest problem with democracy today are the politicians, are the representatives that we put in place to make policies. They either don't understand it or they're basically crooks. Let me put it that way, which is a big risk.
There's a lot of that argument, but let me throw this out for consideration, which is to say, I told you about information asymmetries. And so the question is, do you have a citizenry that is sufficiently well informed to make these, what I call direct democracy decisions in a way? There's evidence that a lot of voters are not interested in elections. They become very passive, so voter participation rates are not as high as they should be. And so what we have is a situation where they seem perfectly willing to delegate it to those who are elected. Well, yes, if you don't hold those elected officials accountable in some way, yes, they're going to start messing with the chestnuts that are in the fire there on their own. And so I have been persuaded, I've been drawn, let me say, to the notion of direct democracy. I had this fantasy, maybe you share the same one, of being able to sit at my computer and vote, number one, and number two, approve or reject legislation, of some kind, and kind of diminish the role of the elected representative. And I have points like that in the latter part of my book. I talk about some ways that we can go forward. And one of the main themes that I tried to emphasize is that in an age of hyper-partisanship, in an age of great suspicion and skepticism about government, we need to restore a measure of trust in government, which is contrary to a lot of people's impulses. A lot of people think of government as the evil incarnate because it's corrupt and all these other kinds of things. But you need a measure of that, even let's say if we were to have a direct democracy, because decisions have to be made, resources are allocated, taxes are collected, spending is made. The average citizen simply doesn't have that level of sophistication. I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm saying that the time and effort that you or I, as an individual citizen, would require to be knowledgeable about all the legislation that is out there, we do nothing else except studying. We would be in politics ourselves, so to speak, in terms of evaluating the legislation. So I think we'll stop short of a direct democracy because we'll still have that level of information. But my point was, through greater transparency, I think we can restore a measure of what I call guarded trust. I like to quote Ronald Reagan, when he was talking about the negotiations over nuclear weapons with the Russians. He said, trust but verify. I think that's a good attitude. Trust government but verify it. I mean, how do you do that? So I'll just give you one of several examples that I have, which is that I don't think you can eliminate self-interested political contributions from helping to shape elections. And people will always do that. And that's because people have different intensity of preferences about what we should do to elect somebody. Some people are indifferent, as I said a while ago. Some people are passionately interested in something, maybe deeply self-interested also, right? That affects my business, my line, and so forth. The point I've been making is that you can't do what, say, an organization like the Common Cause used to tout years ago. If you think of McCain-Feingold, for example, which was to limit how you would fund elections and so forth. My answer is it's a beast that will not go away. So my answer is you cannot, if you want to have a democracy, you cannot hide behind political action committee. You cannot hide behind corporate donations. So I think the Citizens United decision was terrible in the sense that it enabled people to shield their contributions. My answer is, if you're going to have somebody tell me how my resources are allocated, I want to know who gave the money. I want to know where it came from. Let's use that. So I think the media falls short by not tracking that more carefully. And so my answer is greater transparency is one of the greatest catalysts if we can have to improving the measure of trust that we need for governance.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Philip, let me ask you sort of a broad question. You have looked at a lot of these different areas of the world in aggregate terms. Where do you think the world is heading? Let me sort of refine the question. So we see, some cases, we have European Union, we have large trading blocs, we have countries coming together. We have in some cases countries moving apart. We had this COVID-19 shock, and we see large countries have been not that good in counteracting the shock, whereas small countries have been, like New Zealand, South Korea, Germany. So where do you think, so if you look forward 10, 15, 20 years, are we going to get more fragmented, or are we going to come together into larger blocks? Where do you think we'll end up?
I think blocks will evolve. They will morph into various forms. With the European Union, you may remember a famous quip that once was said by Henry Kissinger. Now that you have the European Union, who do I call? In other words, who do I call at the head of that? So you have nominal heads of the European Union, but you have these differences. And so there's an impulse in these days to people to gravitate toward specific religious, ethnic, or other characteristics to define legitimacy of the state. And that's a failing recipe, in my opinion. In other words, I see it tragically in China if they go after the Uyghurs. I see it in the tensions, let's say, in India, where you've got basically different minorities that are there, and they're not enjoying their full rights. And the United States, people want to say, well, America is a white Christian nation run by white men. I mean, this is not a successful formula. I'm sorry, it just will not work. So ironically, I'm optimistic in the sense that sooner or later you come to the realization that there's a universal principle of governance, which is inclusion, accountability, and democratic electability. And that rule actually augurs well, I think, for everyone. And where that's happened, it has facilitated economic growth because it gives greater flexibility to agents, if you will, on the stage, whether they're economic or even political in this case. So I remain stupidly optimistic, I think, perhaps. I'll put it that way. In other words, doggedly from how I've seen the evolution of trade. I mean, you look at what China has done. I laud how the Chinese did raise millions of people, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And we can't deny that. I mean, we should just take that into consideration and say, where would we be if China hadn't done that? You have to celebrate what the Indians have done by basically improving agricultural productivity. They've reduced the risk of famine, which used to be devastating in India. So these are signs of hope, not signs of despair, in my opinion.
Yeah, but I think you make this point all over the book. The necessary condition are institutions,
yes,
and property rights,
yes,
and justice system. And so the question in my mind is, are these things we take for granted? Could they all go away very quickly? And you rewind time back 300 years by a singular person one morning?
They could. Yes, they could. I didn't say that democracy is solid and it's not under threat. It is under threat. There's no question, in my opinion. And so when I know it sounds simplistic, but if I invoke the idea of an independent judiciary, for example, on property rights, you can go further in that direction and say, well, what do you mean by an independent judiciary? What are you upholding? So you get into the questions then of things like, well, how universal and valid is capital punishment? Here the Taliban have come back to power in Afghanistan, and they're reportedly summarily executing people with no trial by jury, none of those things that we would assume would have taken root somehow in Afghanistan, but obviously has not. So the idea is that those institutions are important, but they become fundamentally effective only to the extent to which we have transparency and accountability. So when you put down and you have press censorship and you're executing journalists, you are doing yourself in as a country, whoever's doing it.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Philip. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.